Good afternoon, everyone. It's Andrea Bourrie, OPPI President, and I have with me here today at the OPPI office Ann Joyner, Chair of our Professional Regulation Strategy Group, and MPP Peter Milczyn is joining us by phone, and I'll ask MPP Milczyn to make some formal comments in just a minute. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day for this important webinar. The webinar is being recorded to make sure that it is available to a wider section of OPPI's membership. To ensure that we have audio quality that is high, all participants are muted by default. We have about 144 participants today, and that's a really great response. Also, so that we can have a clear recording of the webinar, we're going to hold all questions to the end, but I do encourage you to write your questions throughout the presentation. More information will be provided on how to use the chat function before we start the formal question and answer period. But if you look at the bottom left of your screen, you'll see the chat button, and that's where you can click to type your question in at any time. Before we get things underway, I want to let you know that we likely will finish before the hour, but don't worry, you can still include this for a full professional learning credit, continuous professional learning credit, and I hope that you will remember to go in and log in to do that. Again, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to participate, and at this time, I'd like to ask MPP Peter Milczyn to make some comments to you.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you for this afternoon's webinar. Andrea and the team have asked that I call in this afternoon to give you some brief remarks about my private member's bill about governing and regulating the planning profession. And before I get into my remarks, I just want to thank you all for joining in. Your team at the OPPI has worked tirelessly to educate MPPs and political staff from all the political parties about the issues of concern to your organization and your profession. And I wholeheartedly support the OPPI's efforts to connect with members of the legislature to get this bill passed with the support of the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the New Democrats. And my reasoning is simple. The planning profession seeks to protect and promote the public interest. And it goes without saying how important urban, rural, and regional planning is to all of Ontario's communities. In my career at both the municipal and provincial level, I've seen firsthand how good planning ensures that municipalities of all sizes have what they need to grow and prosper. And at the heart of this bill, this legislation seeks to protect and promote the reputation of the planning profession and its members through enhanced regulation. And if passed, this bill will reassure decision makers at all levels of government and the public that they are receiving expert advice from credible professionals. Regulation will give planners the support they need to apply municipal policies and provincial legislation more consistently, and it will ensure that qualified individuals are at the helm, taking charge of issues that face these communities. And furthermore, being part of a regulated profession means that you as practitioners will be given more respect by government, more credibility as experts, and more influence on government policy. It will also encourage the professional planners with the designation RPP perform independently as well as to a high standard of expertise. And so where are we in the process now? Currently, we're in the final stages of drafting the legislation. We're going back and forth with the legislative lawyers, making some small tweaks. Once the draft is complete, I will work with OPPI to make sure we have additional support for this bill at Queen's Park and try to receive unanimous support. And the next step in the process will be to introduce this private member's bill for debate in the legislature. And the next opportunity for this will be September 21st this year, and that will be followed up with a debate on the draft bill on October 6th of this year. So I just want to thank all of you for having me here today, and I'm going to stay on the line and look forward to listening to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, MPP Milczyn, for taking the time to address our membership. I know that there are a number of people who are very interested in hearing your perspective, and I do appreciate that you'll stay on the line. And perhaps if there are some questions that are people want to ask of you, I'll ask you to answer those and let you know at the end of the presentation if that's going to be the case.
Sure.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so everybody, at this point in time, I'd like to introduce Ann Joyner. As I mentioned, that Ann has been doing a lot of work on this topic for a number of years, and she is going to run through the presentation. So, Ann, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, MPP Milczyn, as well. The Professional Regulation Strategy Group really appreciates the support that we've received from both OPPI here and the staff and council and Mr. Milczyn over the last year or so. So my remarks are going to provide some more insight into the context of the legislation.
So the issues that OPPI have brought forward were around changing the existing legislation to give greater clarity to who is a professional planner, and certainly along with that comes the knowledge that it is you are a profession which regulates your ethics and your standards of practice. So from a practical point of view, in my experience, when people question, who's giving this advice to a municipality or to a community, the ability to say that this is a professional planner, to have a clear definition of that, and to be able to reassure the public that somebody is acting to a high level of ethics, of professional integrity, that they have a certain level of education. I think that's a big plus. And it's been a long time since your legislation has been enacted, and with so many other types of individuals using the term planner somewhat loosely, I think it's high time to strengthen this legislation and strengthen what the designation RPP means in Ontario.
That's great, MPP Milczyn, and thanks for providing that additional context. We seem to be having a little bit of trouble with the slides. I'm not sure that people are seeing the slide deck, but Ann is going to continue on, and she's going to give the full presentation, and then we will take questions at the end of the presentation. So we're working on the technical difficulties so people can see the slides, but if you bear with us, Ann will give you a verbal presentation until we can get the visuals back up, and then I'll go to questions and answers. So listen to Ann, and we'll get going.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'm just going to give a bit of a context to the Act that will be coming forward in the fall. As a starting point, the OPPI Private Act was the first in Canada to protect the title Registered Professional Planner. And that was passed in 1994, and it was called the Ontario Professional Planners Institute Act. So at that point, we were ahead of the curve, and we were ahead of the other affiliates in Canada. In the almost 25 years since that time, most of the other provinces have passed public legislation that goes further than our OPPI Act. For example, the province of Alberta passed legislation, as well as Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and PEI and Newfoundland are in the process of drafting new legislation. BC and Quebec are reviewing and enhancing existing legislation. So over the intervening 25 years, OPPI has actually moved from being the head of the pack to being following some of the other affiliates, which just really emphasizes that it's high time for us to get this legislation in hand. The other thing I just wanted to point out is that the move to public legislation is a key component of OPPI's overall strategic direction. The Inspire OPPI program, which all of you will remember from the time when there was a lot of feedback being provided by members to OPPI. And OPPI's new strategic plan sets out a vision, mission, and strategic directions that engage members related professionals, and the public to inform and shape a better Ontario. So specifically, how does this relate to our initiative here to get a bill that's public? The strategic plan had 4 directions, and 2 of those are of key relevance to this. The first is to promote and safeguard professionalism, and the second is to build RPP, the term RPP, as a recognized brand to planners, decision makers, and key stakeholders. So implementing those 2 directions, the platform has been to move our legislation forward into a more robust form, basically public. There are 2 other strategic directions that you may be aware of to facilitate the exchange of knowledge and expertise for the betterment of planning in Ontario and to implement and empower member ownership and community experience. So those 4 pillars all are directly in alignment with this initiative to move to a public act. So as noted by MPP Milczyn, planning is a profession that seeks to protect the public interest. And in the public interest, the proposed bill further raises awareness of the importance of planning and the role planners have in creating and fostering healthy communities. That's basically the fundamental underpinning to our desire to move towards public legislation as well articulated by Mr. Milczyn. So further to that, great plans need great planners, and great plans ensure communities have what they need to grow, prosper, and protect the environment we depend on. And it makes sense to protect and promote the reputation of the group who implements these plans. There have been many planning-related acts and amendments to acts, as we all are very well involved and with in the past several months. And I think those just illustrate the importance that the public has to ensure that the reputation of the group who implements the plans, i.e. planners, are well regulated. So now let's focus on the bill itself. I think we have the slides back up. We should be on one that says proposed bill. So first of all, we are hoping to move forward to have a bill introduced and that will result in a public act through what is known as a private member's public bill. So yikes, what the heck is a private member's public bill? It is a confusing term, and I'll take just a moment to try to explain that. So any private member, in other words, any member who's not a speaker or a cabinet minister, can introduce a private member's public bill. And that's what the intent is to do here, is MPP Milczyn has kindly offered to work with us to bring forward this bill, as he noted. And there's a long sort of public process, including committee work and opportunities for the public to be involved, and that will culminate in royal assent after the bill goes through the committee process. So what is the bill? I think that's probably why most of you are on the phone, is to get a better understanding. So what exactly will this bill contain? So the bill itself is being written by the government and will be available for review when it's public. So to some extent, it's out of the hands of the OPPI staff at the moment and in the hands of the legislators. And as I say, when it's completed, it will be public, and at that very moment, OPPI will make sure the notice is given to all planners that they can take a look at it. But at this time, I can give you an overview of what we can expect. First of all, about 80% of the proposed legislation is based on a template to address administrative matters and formalize what we already have in place in our existing legislation. All professions that are regulated are similar in this respect, so there's basically a template that you could look at any of the legislation for any of the publicly regulated professions, and you'd see very, very similar information. And I'd even go as far as say is that element of the Act is sort of the boring policy piece, and it specifically addresses things like professional standards, how competency, ethics, and accreditation and certification will be administered. It covers how continuous professional learning is required and how it will be administered. It covers the members of council and how there are public members on council. It covers what the discipline committee, how it's set up and what they do. It covers complaints and the appeals processes, and it includes a definition of planning, which incidentally does not change from our existing legislation. So 80% of the proposed legislation covers those administrative matters. So what's different? How is the proposed bill different? It covers what duties we have now more explicitly, but in terms of new elements, I'm going to cover two. The first is that the designation of Registered Professional Planner, RPP, would remain protected and reserved for use of practicing full members. In addition, the title Professional Planner will also be protected, except when used in obviously different contexts. In other words, only RPPs can represent themselves as planners and use this designation. So this is an important reinforcement of what we have today in our private bill, but in a public bill context. I guess associated with that, employers would be able to continue to choose whether they want to have membership in OPPI or RPP designation status as a requirement of a position. The second and most fundamental and valuable aspect of this public legislation is about public respect and credibility. The proposed bill would formally, the members of OPPI through this bill would formally become accountable to the government and the public instead of being only accountable to ourselves and the Institute. So this is a fundamental change from our current act. And what we've found actually is that many members think we already have this. In fact, we don't. So public legislation will make what many members think occurs now a reality. And some of the specific elements of that would be that on council there could be between 1 and 3 members appointed by the government. And through having a public bill, we achieve more credibility and respect in consultations for new legislation and policy. There's also an area where there is no change that I want to highlight, and that is an area I get quite a few questions about, and that's to do with accreditation. So the accreditation process for university planning programs and the certification process for candidate members would not change as a result of the passage of this bill as currently formulated. The Professional Standards Board has been set up through Planning for the Future to have this responsibility, and there's no intent to have a change to that. It's a robust and fulsome and comprehensive program. So no change to the current accreditation processes. So as mentioned by MPP Milczyn, what are the next steps? So first of all, we will continue to meet with MPPs and work with Legislative Council and the government's legal drafting department on the final version of the bill. So as I say, the remarks I've made are based on what we're working towards, but the final bill will be what the government decides it will be. We're also anticipating that MPP Milczyn will introduce in September this private members public bill, and that the time frame from that through to getting royal assent would be a number of months. And as noted, the sponsorship of the bill is a result of lengthy consultations with members of the provincial parliament, MPPs from all 3 parliaments and their staff. And I do want to just mention, we've met with over 100 MPPs and their staff, and we're really, really grateful to Mr. Milczyn for their hard work in helping us achieve those meetings. OPPI's representatives have also met with many other stakeholders, such as the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and other associations like BUILD, the homeowners, OAA, OBA, etc. So again, many thanks to OPPI staff, Andrea, and the Professional Regulation Strategy Group for their time and commitment to making all of these meetings happen over the past few months. So finally, as we get to the end of my presentation, if introduced, the bill will have first and second reading, and we're hoping that at that point it would be referred to committee for further consideration and then be reported back to the House for third reading and passage. It is a public process, and OPPI will actively participate to promote the bill. I do need to just mention that private members' public bills can often get stuck at committee, as can all bills. But we are hopeful that as a result of all the hard work that we and others have done and the support we've gathered, we will get this bill through to Royal Assent. So what can you do? What role can you play? Every person on this call has an important role to play to implement this legislation. First, we would encourage you to contact your local MPPs and express to them your support for this bill. I have personally done this with my own MPP in Durham Region, and he was very open and interested in the bill and in the role OPPI plays and in what planners are doing. It was a very easy conversation, so I really encourage you to make the call. You can find information for your MPP at the contact that's on the slide, and I'm sure you could all Google and find it as well, like I did. Other things that you can do is to explain this initiative to your planning friends and colleagues in related professions. Talk to them. Talk to them about why this is important and why they should support it. And you can refer to OPPI's Professional Regulation webpage to remind yourself of the key messages and to provide others with information. And all the information on the past webinars is also on the website. So just to recap, if you take away anything from this webinar, I'll give you three things. The first is that the bill will be introduced in the legislature, we hope in September, and it recognizes the importance of planning and planners in the province of Ontario. The second is that the bill proposes to formalize many of the things that OPPI is already doing, but it holds us accountable to the legislature and the people of Ontario. That's the fundamental change. And thirdly, your support in contacting your MPP could make all the difference, and we really encourage you to do this. So thank you so much for your time today and your interest. We are quite thrilled to have so much interest, and we've covered a lot of ground here, and we'd like to take questions at this moment.
That's great. Thank you, Anne, so much for that presentation. I hope that the participants on this webinar found it useful. Peter, I'm wondering if there's anything that you would like to add to the formal presentation before I get into questions and answers. Is there anything that you would like to add?
Well, I think it was just a very good point that was made that individuals should contact their local MPPs and talk to them about why they think this is important. It's not necessarily an issue that would come to the mind of most MPPs. It's completely apolitical. It is completely non-controversial. I think individual members just need to be made aware of why this is important, and the most effective way is for their constituents to contact them about it.
That's great. Thank you very much for that reminder. So now what I'd like to do is start the formal question and answer period. And I'd like to encourage you to use the chat function, which is located at the bottom left-hand side of the screen. What you need to do is click that chat button to activate the text window and type your question and hit enter. If for some reason that is not working, you're welcome to email the question. We are monitoring info@ontarioplanners.ca, and we will certainly take questions in that format as well. And actually, I have one that has come in by email that I'm going to pose. And the format that we're going to use is that I'm going to read out the questions that have been asked, and then Anne or Brian Brophy, who is our registrar and staff person working on this, or even if you have a question for MPP Milczyn, I'll ask him to answer the question as well. So the first one that has come in by email is, what is the sanction for a planner who represents him or herself as a professional planner but is not an OPPI member? Brian, do you want to answer that question for us?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. The current legislation, like the 1994 Act, says that a person who does that is guilty of an offense and can be fined up to $5,000. So that's covered by the Provincial Offences Act generally. In the new bill, of course, it's not finalized, but if we look at more recent professional regulation legislation that's not 25 years old, for instance, the human resources professionals got a similar bill through the legislature about 3 years ago, and in that case, it specifies that the fine for improper misuse of the designation is $25,000. So it's a more serious fine, and that's partly because it's public legislation, and it's partly just because inflation since 1994.
That's great, Brian. Thank you so much for that. Another question has come in that says, will the legislation allow or require OPPI to restrict the practice of a non-member planner? How will the interests of such individuals be protected in the light of OPPI seeking further professional regulation? So, Anne, do you want to try and tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. And Brian, jump in. But the intent is to ensure that people who are operating as professional planners and who are putting themselves forward as professional planners and doing what would conventionally be considered by reasonable people to be professional planning are RPPs. The intent is not to try to restrict practicing non-members from doing things that are not strictly professional planning. So to that extent, their rights are protected, because it's only if they cross the line and are clearly operating in conventional areas of professional planning that any reasonable person would identify so that they would potentially be sanctioned.
Great. Brian, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I would just agree. Professional planners do a very broad range of things, obviously, and it's not realistic to restrict all of those different activities to only OPPI members, and that's certainly not the intention of this legislation. Rather, it's the overall package of presenting yourself as a certified, regulated professional planner subject to a professional code of practice and a complaints and discipline process. That's what's restricted, and so you can only make that claim if, in fact, you are an OPPI member under the new Act.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So the next question that I have come in is similar, but it's a little bit different, and I think it's a really good one because it gets to the crux of a couple of day-to-day activities that we as planners have to deal with. So the question is as follows. Following enactment of the legislation, will individuals who are not professional planners and call themselves something else be allowed to file planning applications under the Planning Act and or prepare planning justification reports in support of those applications? So, Anne, why don't you tackle that one?
Thanks, Andrea. This is a great question, and the short answer is yes, they can. The legislation does not specify any individual activities that will be restricted to being completed by RPP professional planners. We had tossed around the idea of a legislation that did touch on restricting activities and have moved away from that perspective. So there are no activities in this legislation that are being restricted to being completed by RPP planners.
Great. Thanks, Anne. So the next question that I have that has come in is as follows. Is there an information package that could be forwarded to MPPs to provide them with the background of this private members bill? And the answer, Brian, is?
Yes. Yes, there is. It's all on the website, but we can post that alongside when we post this webinar, I suppose, just to make it even more accessible. There is an information package. This was what was sent out to remind the MPPs of what we spoke to them in person about in many cases, of course. Actually, we know who's on this webinar, so we can just forward this directly to you in case you want it. That would be the simplest thing to do.
So just to recap there, the material is on the professional regulation page on the website, but Catherine, thank you so much for that question, and we will make sure that all participants who are registered have that information package sent to them so that you're able to contact your MPPs. So the next question that I have, Rob, thanks so much for sending this one out, and a big shout out to you. Will this mean that you must be a professional planner to conduct planning in the province of Ontario, like a doctor or an engineer? So Anne and Brian, who wants to tackle that one, because that's a really good one.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's similar to the issue around planning activities. So the answer is that people cannot call themselves an RPP or a professional planner who are not members of OPPI, and they can't say that they are professional planner and do professional planning if they're not an RPP. But it doesn't mean that you can call yourself something else and do planning activities, because none of the activities are being restricted through this legislation.
Okay, and out in Ottawa, Nelson, thanks so much for your question, which is as follows. It relates to this whole idea about practicing planning in another province. And I know that there's a lot of people who are very concerned that they're able to have that mobility. So the question is, what about a planner registered in another province but working in Ontario? Many offices work across the country. What about professionals who move to the province but are not yet full members in Ontario? How is this new legislation going to affect them? Anne, you can answer that one, I think.
Yeah, so thank you. That's a great question, too. It's of paramount importance, I think, to OPPI and to the larger group of affiliates through CIP that we have mobility of planners and that the standards are consistent across the country to allow for this kind of movement. And the proposed bill will have no impact on the accreditation process for university planning programs or certification process for Canadian members at large. So there's no change to how people have mobility today.
Yeah, and definitely the subject of topic was a subject of the President's meeting that I attended at the CIP conference in Quebec City, and certainly that reciprocity agreements in terms of making sure that there is still access to mobility for the profession across the country was talked about, and it exists now, and it will continue with this new legislation. So a related question that has come in talks about sort of the allied professions and architects, landscape architects, and others who do planning type work, and how will they be affected? How will their work be affected? So the question is, will the reasonable areas of professional planning be defined in the legislation, and how will that affect these allied professions? Brian, do you want to tackle that one?
Thanks, Andrea. Following up on Anne's answers to a couple of related questions, I would just point out that the new legislation won't really have to define any particular acts, restricted acts, or scope of practice, because this isn't right to practice legislation, and we aren't claiming, exclusive right to do those things. So certainly, as we're aware right now, in some cases, architects or landscape architects are doing things that overlap with professional planning. The new legislation won't change that. They'll be able to continue doing that. they will just have to, as it stands now, they can do those things as long as they don't call themselves registered professional planners. Under the new Act, they would have to avoid calling themselves RPPs or professional planners. So there's a slight expansion there of protection of designation, but certainly they can still say, well, I'm an architect and I'm doing this activity and I'm governed by another regulator, and that would be fine with us. The public is still protected in that case as they're a regulated professional being overseen.
Thank you, Brian, for that answer. The next question that has come in relates to a governance question, and it is, how will this new legislation affect OPPI's bylaws? I'm going to answer that one myself. I'm going to draw the president's card on that one. And the simple answer is that the bylaws are going to need to be revised to match the legislation, because there are some minor wording changes in terms of how we name committees, the composition of council, and some what I'll call more sort of housekeeping matters that will need to get addressed. And we will certainly do that once royal assent has been received, and the membership will have an opportunity to be involved in that bylaw update process. Okay, let's see what else we have. Okay, the next question that has come in relates to the examination process, and those of you who are still going through the examination process will be happy to hear the answer, and those of you who have already gone through the exam process will probably also be glad to hear it. So the question is, will there be a new or an extra exam required to become an RPP in Ontario as a result of this new legislation? And again, I'm going to draw the president's card here, and I'm going to answer that myself and say no. No new exam, no extra exam required. The process is exactly the same, and once you have that full RPP, you will remain having full status. Okay. At this point, I don't have any more questions that have come in. Oh, sorry, I understand. I have late coming. I have one more question that's coming in here. Maybe while I wait for that one to come, MPP Milczyn, is there anything else that you would like to say to the OPPI members before we draw the webinar to a close?
No, it's been a pleasure working with you, Andrea, and your team, and I'm looking forward to having this bill passed.
That's great. Just bear with me 1 second, everybody, while I wait for the actual question to arrive in front of me. Technology is a wonderful thing, except for when it doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. So, okay. We want to know more, if people want to know more about professional regulation, they can certainly log on to the webpage, and just to give you direction to that, it's the Who We Are section, and the professional regulation page is there. So the last question that I have, at least at this point in time, is, so someone can still call themselves planners, do all the work of a member, and appear at the OMB to provide expert opinion. Does not seem to be a step forward for our profession. Any thoughts? I just want to clarify that that's not entirely true. They cannot do the work that is defined as being planning under the definition of planning, because there is a clause in the legislation that says, even if you're not calling yourself a planner, but you're holding yourself out to be a planner or doing work that planners would normally do or is covered off in the definition of planning, that still is in contravention of this new legislation. So it's called a holding out provision, and it's kind of like if it looks like a duck and it talks like a duck, and then it is a duck kind of situation, and certainly OPPI Council would take the necessary steps, as would any member who would be bringing that to attention of the profession, to say that that's not appropriate. It's in contravention of the legislation, and there would be a discipline process that would be pursued. So thank you so much for the question, and I think it is an important one, and it's a very important step forward in the legislation, because right now we need to be able to address that. Brian, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that answer?
I'll just address the sort of the half of the question about the Ontario Municipal Board. And as it is, the OMB, as a arm's-length government tribunal, it controls the process and the decision around who it will accept or not accept as an expert witness. So there's no piece of legislation that could change that. Like, we can't order the OMB to reject non-OPPI members or anything. That just wouldn't work legally. But I will add that those of you who follow OMB decisions will note that the board is more and more likely to indeed accept and value OPPI membership, and think that that's an excellent basis to assume that the witness is an expert witness, and in many cases will reject a non-OPPI member. And that has to do with what Andrea was talking about, the holding out clause. If you are actually an OPPI member, you are bound by a professional code of practice. You have certain ethical standards that you have to meet, and if you don't, there are consequences for you. Whereas a non-member is not bound to the same extent, and the Ontario Municipal Board is very well aware of that. They've referred to it in some of their written decisions.
Thank you, Brian. And as always happens when people know that the question window is closing, they send some more questions in, which is great. So I have one coming in from out in southwestern Ontario, so thanks very much, Paul, for your question. And it reads as follows. I appreciate all of the hard work on this, but can you elaborate on the reasoning for not pursuing a more aggressive regulatory approach? I thought we were tracking towards this with an OPPI membership consultations, i.e., you have to be an RPP to provide an opinion or to prepare a report. So that very sort of strict regulatory approach. And why don't you tackle that one?
Thanks, Andrea, and then you can jump in. Thanks for the question. It's a good one because you're correct. We did assess a number of options, and one of the options was a more aggressive approach to the legislation. And the answer is that the legislation, as we've described it today, is an important and essential first step to get us to a more enhanced regulatory status. We worked hard with a lot of various stakeholders to engage and ensure their support of this legislation. And the way it's developed now does that. It achieves that support from both our fellow professions and the government. But we also agree that it is important that we see this as a first step and potentially move towards further regulation, which could occur two ways. One is through enhancements to a public act, and the second is through changes to the legislation that we work under, the Ontario Professional Plan, or the Planning Act, or other legislation that we work with, or the regulations associated with that. So there actually are regulations related to renewable energy, actually, that require RPPs to do certain activities. And that approach could be expanded by the government to address other areas that the government feels it's important that professional planners are the owners of certain activities. It would be important to us that if folks on this phone or your friends and colleagues think this is important, that continues to be made apparent to OPPI Council and all the rest of us, so that we know where we go next, and we continue to pursue the ongoing evolution of our profession.
Thanks, Anne. And I will say that it has been identified as an important element in the new strategic plan, Inspire OPPI. The strategic planning process that was just recently released does talk about continuing to pursue that additional regulatory aspect. So, Paul, I can assure you that it is on the radar, and we would all love to be able to see that additional provision that you need to be an RPP to prepare a professional planning report, but we felt that it was best to take it a step at a time, but it's on the agenda for sure. So the next question that I have that's come in is if the legislation does not limit any planning activities that can be conducted, and it's already an offense to call yourself an RPP, does this mean the legislation effectively only adds calling yourself a professional planner as a prohibited activity? Brian, why don't you answer that one?
It adds professional planner as a prohibited title for non-members. Really, the most important difference about the bill is not so much what's in it, but the fact that it is public legislation. We've had the private legislation for 25 years. This is public legislation. It is not right to practice like doctors and physicians, as was asked earlier, but it puts us more on a similar level to those other more fully self-regulated professions where a piece of legislation has been passed that the legislature feels is in the public interest and affects the entire province, and it says, look, you as a profession must be accountable to the government so that we can make sure you're doing the right things, and that's in the public interest. And that is actually a huge step forward. It's a little bit abstract, and I know it may feel difficult to get excited about, but it's a huge step forward as opposed to now where we have this private legislation. The government does not really formally notice us. I mean, we have great relations with the ministries, and they value our advice, but that's just something that we've earned over time. There's no legislative backup for that.
And that's a great point. MPP Milczyn, would you like to provide any additional commentary on that? Because I know that that's something that we have certainly talked a lot to you about, and you felt was very important in giving your support to us in terms of bringing this bill forward, is that public accountability. Anything that you'd like to comment on?
Well, just to the issue of moving towards being a fully regulated profession, that's something that would really require the government to initiate. And I haven't heard the real burning desire for that to be created. And so it's not something that can't be done in the future, but at this particular time, there doesn't appear to be that level of interest in doing it. I think this could be a good step of modernizing the legislation, raising the issue. A few years down the road, you may want to go further. I know municipalities would have some concerns about that, especially smaller municipalities. And some of the other professions that I know Andrea and her team did a lot of work talking to the architects, the engineers, the landscape architects, and others. It would turn it into a controversial issue that it would be difficult to achieve at this particular point in time, I think.
Thank you very much for that, and I think that that's a very important point to make, and we certainly appreciate your support in helping us have a lot of great discussion with other MPPs and stakeholders, and for OPPI members on the phone to understand that it has been a process that has been underway for many years, and this public accountability and the raising the profile of the profession is important, and that public interest piece is important, and we felt that this was the most appropriate step in that many-year process. So thank you for that. Okay, the next question that I have is a dollar value question, not surprisingly. So the question is, following enactment of the legislation, will RPPs be paying additional annual fees? And the answer, I'm going to take the President's card on this one again, is that there's no anticipated additional fees as a result of the legislation. There's nothing that would necessitate that. But as you know, OPPI Council goes through an annual budgeting process, and budgets are established based on the direction in the strategic plan and the mandate that we have in front of us. At this point in time, we have done a review of what the legislation would require, and we don't anticipate anything that would be directly related to this. So we get good value for the enhancement, not anticipating any additional costs. Okay, I'm going to call out again and see if there are any additional questions that people have. I have none in front of me, and I have no one waving at me that there's one coming through email. So last call. Okay, that's great. I think that I would like to ask Brian just to make one final comment, and then I'll wrap things up.
Thanks, Andrea. I just wanted to finish off your last answer, that we don't expect, higher member fees would be a result of this legislation. And that ties into something that Anne said in her presentation. OPPI is already doing basically everything that a fully self-regulated professional body does. That's what we've built up over the past 25 years. So it's not like this legislation would pass and then we would say, oh my gosh, we have to start a complaints committee and a discipline committee and so on. We already have most of that in place, and that's why we don't anticipate extra or higher costs.
Thanks for that clarification, Brian. So to everybody who's on the phone, thank you so much for taking time out of your warm summer day to participate in this webinar. I hope that you found it useful, and I encourage you to record your continuous professional learning credit for taking part. I will let you know that the presentation will be posted on the Digital Learning Library shortly, and we've made a commitment to make sure that that information package that you can use to contact your local MPP is sent directly to all registrants on this call. And MPP Milczyn, I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody who is on the phone for your participation today, but most importantly for your continued support of the planning profession, for what we do to make this province great, and for your sponsorship of the bill. We are looking forward to celebrating success with you come the fall. Thank you so much.
It's an honor to be helping you.
That's great. So thanks, everybody. That wraps things up, and I wish you a safe day and a great summer. Happy long weekend, and we'll talk soon. Bye.